Jane here, honestly speaking with Professor Bascom. How are you today?
I'm very good, very good.
Yes. So you are a journalist, author, professor, all-around writer and communicator.
All around writer and communicator, yes.
So let's start backwards. As a professor, what do you teach and where?
I teach at Western Connecticut State University. I've taught there for 33 years, and I teach a wide variety of writing programs, fiction, nonfiction, anything but poetry.
I like poetry, though.
I'm not good at it, so I just avoid it. Students are better at it than I am.
That's fine. So you start, I know you have background as a journalist. So how do you transition from journalism to go into teaching? What was your motivation for that?
Like many things in my life, it was a complete accident. My wife's friend was a dean at the university, and the person who ran the journalism program passed away suddenly. So they needed somebody to teach temporarily while they found a replacement. That was 33 years ago. And so I learned how to be an academic, but I had always been a journalist. I worked for Time Inc., I worked for Money Magazine, I worked for United Press International, I worked for Pacific Stars and Stripes in Tokyo. So I've been writing stories my whole life, and so writing books is a longer version of what I was used to doing. And so I began writing books, and one book led to another, and before I knew it, I had, I don't even know how many, maybe 12 or 13 books that I've done.
Wow. So you're teaching, and one day you wake up and you say, I want to write a book?
No, one of my colleagues and I were at his agent's house in Scarsdale, and he was dropping off some manuscript or something. She said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I write stories." She said, "What about?" I said, "Just about anything, any kind of nonfiction." Anyway, she called me about 3 months later and asked me if I would consider collaborating on a book with a woman who had had a near-death experience. And I said, "Let me meet her and we'll see." And so we did that book. And the book was called Full Circle, and it was about this woman's near-death experience, and more importantly, about her lifestyle transformation. So I interviewed the scientists who had studied this phenomena, and there are scientists who study this, and it's a real science at the University of Connecticut. And they said that the bigger story is the transformations that these people go through after they've had a near-death experience. I said, "Let me see the research." And so I looked at the research, and what I discovered was just quite a phenomena. People who have near-death experiences undergo a dramatic lifestyle transformation. Most of the time, it's positive. But this woman that I did the first book with, she was a very wealthy woman in Michigan. She left Michigan, she came to UConn to be with these researchers. And she went from being a very wealthy woman to a woman living in a studio somewhere in some apartment complex in Connecticut. And she was perfectly happy doing it. And she started doing odd things like visiting the dying people in the hospitals that she didn't know and holding their hand. And I said, why do you do this? And she says, I have to. I have to tell them that dying is part of life and there's a better place. I said, in a religious sense? She said, no, not in a religious sense, in an actual sense. I said, how do you know? And she says, I've been there. And these people make all kinds of bizarre claims like they met God.
Amanda Jane here, honestly speaking, live at the New Hope Baptist Church in Danbury, Connecticut with Professor Bascom. That was very interesting for your first layer of books. Fast forward, you wrote a series of books kind of digging into the history of the Harlem Renaissance. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So could you share what was the motivation factor for that?
As a reporter, as a writer, I'm always curious about all kinds of things. One summer I was in Washington at the Library of Congress, and I love libraries, and so the Library of Congress is a wonderful place for me to go. You just tell them you want boxes and boxes of material about this, there, that. They'll bring you one box at a time. You have to wear white gloves so that the oil on your hands don't damage the manuscripts. But I was reading unpublished manuscripts from Harlem that I discovered online. And I went there, and they kept bringing me boxes and boxes of stories, of unpublished stories by Ralph Ellison, Dorothy West, Zora Neal Hurston. And so I was just fascinated by what I had found. So I collected all the stories I could find from the Work Progress Administration, the WPA, about Harlem. And I collected those, and that became the source of my first Harlem book. The second Harlem book was about Dorothy West, because in my research I kept reading that she was the youngest member of the Harlem Renaissance. She had some sort of modest success as a writer, as a short story writer. But what I discovered is Dorothy had been an accomplished short story writer, but from the time she was about 15 in Boston. And she'd won all kinds of literary awards in Boston. She applied to a literary award in Harlem for a magazine called Opportunity, and they brought her to New York for a ceremony where she won second prize for a short story that she had written. And she won a second prize along with Zora Neal Hurston. They had to share the second prize. Zora didn't care for that very much, and she complained about it all the time. But that's how Dorothy got to New York. What I discovered is Dorothy touted herself as the last living member of the Harlem Renaissance. So she referred to herself as the last leaf on a tree of literary people from Harlem. Dorothy was much more than that. My research showed that she was probably the most prolific member of the Harlem Renaissance, beyond Langston Hughes, Zora Neal Hurston, and all the others that we know. But she was quiet about it. She wrote short stories for the New York Daily News for 20 years under her byline, quietly. And she had the same literary agent as Eleanor Roosevelt. That's an accomplishment.
Exactly. Now, we all have these defining moments in research, and from what I've read about you and learned about you, you've come across some people who've had significant defining moments, but they weren't put in the forefront.
Exactly.
So just briefly, tell us some names of people who didn't get their, accolades for.
There was, in some cases, the cameras on them weren't focused sharply enough. For example, A. Philip Randolph is credited with being the labor leader of the first black union, the Pullman Porters Union. He certainly did that, but he did much more. He was the founder of the March on Washington movement, which was a national movement, which was used as a lever to convince the federal government to make certain concessions for Negroes, for black people. He was instrumental in getting the federal contractors to be integrated in a compromise with the President Roosevelt. And he did this quietly. And he used as a lever the threat of bringing black people to Washington to protest. Those protests never occurred, but the plans were always in place. Another person is a wonderful writer whose stories I found at the Library of Congress, Vivian Morris. She was an accomplished journalist. I don't know where she learned her skills, but I'm a journalism professor. She wrote as well as anybody I know, in the business or out of the business. This was in 1938, 1937, 30. Yeah, I think she only worked for the WPA for a year and a half. But in that year and a half, she wrote wonderful stories, which are in A Renaissance in Harlem, my first Harlem book. But if you read those stories, Harlem comes alive. The Harlem churches come alive. There's a building somewhere in 135th Street called Racehorse Row. And you could go in there and gamble. You could do all kinds of things there. But she made that building come alive. It wasn't just some place where people went to gamble. They went there to socialize. They went there to meet each other. They went there because they hadn't seen cousins in a long time, and they knew they could find them there. She did another piece of some women who work in a laundry. Awful work. There were so many white shirts in this room that she went in, you would be blinded by it, by the whiteness. She snuck in there. She wasn't supposed to be in there. And the people who ran the place did not want people like her in because she was a reporter.
Exactly.
Well, they didn't want a reporter in there telling his stories, and the work was just awful. You can imagine how hot it must have been in August to work in this environment. These women sang to each other all day long to cope with their circumstances. This makes Harlem come alive when you read these stories in tandem, which I did at the library. My problem at the library is I never want to leave. I don't know what I'm going to do with this stuff, but I just want to read stuff after stuff. I'll tell you one story, how this stuff does come alive, literally. You talk about broadcast and recording. I found a manuscript for a pushcart vendor, and he called himself Kingfish, and he sold fish. In those days, you didn't have to go to a grocery store. Somebody would come to your block. So Kingfish would go to a black neighborhood, he'd sing spirituals. He'd go to a Jewish neighborhood, he'd sing Yiddish. He'd go to an Italian neighborhood, he'd sing opera. But that was to get the housewives to open their windows, and he could shout up to them and tell them what kind of fish he had. So they give me this manuscript at the library. Now, you imagine, I'm sitting with white gloves, and I'm reading. I don't want to leave. I just want to read more and more.
Right.
One of the librarians comes to me, and they said, the folk life people would like to see you when you finish. I said, how do they know I'm here? They said, everybody knows you're here. Everybody knows what you're doing. So I walk to the old part of the library. They take me into this little room. They take a little cassette tape recorder, and they played something, and I almost had a heart attack. I hear Kingfish singing an aria in Italian because they had taped him.
Wow.
The WPA had taped him. They followed him around, and they taped him. Now, that just made that story that I just read 10 minutes ago come alive. I could hear his voice, and I got chills because a piece of history had been preserved, and I was in a library where I read the flat piece, which was okay,
Right.
and then I could see, and he had all these little ditties. We talk about rap music. He had all these limericks and these rhymes that he would use. I got clams, I got fish, and he would rhyme the variety of fish that he had that day. And then the next day and this is all spontaneous. He would make it up to next day, because the next day he'd have a different kind of fish. You know, I got catfish, I got porgies, I got whatever he had. Anyway, that was my experience at the library. So I learned to detangle myself and collect all this stuff and turn it into a book.
Now, we're here live at the New Hope Baptist Church. There's something very pivotal about this church and your upbringing. Tell me what this church means to you from you as a young man growing up.
This was our family church. At the time, there were 2 black churches in this small town, and this was one of them. This building we're in now is a brand new building that's probably 4 years old or 5 years old. And there were 3 versions of the church built over the years. But this is where I got my moral compass. This is where the elders would scold me for sitting in the wrong seat and or being late for choir or whatever I was doing. And I was a bit of a scallywag as a kid.
I haven't heard that in years.
I know. I'm reading all these old manuscripts, so I have all this old language stuck in my head. But this church we left this church in 1963 to go on the March on Washington. This church was a very big part of it, and we had chaperones that watched the youth group go down to Washington and come back from Washington. This is where my parents, all my family are buried. We have the services here when someone passes. And so this is a grounding place for me. And my mother would be happy to hear me say that.
Oh, well, we're going to take a pause for a second. This is Amanda Jane, and we'll be right back, honestly speaking, with Professor Bascom. Hi, it's Amanda. Amanda Jane. Hi, it's Amanda Jane. I'm back here, honestly speaking, live at the New Hope Baptist Church. And in honor of Black History Month, I get the pleasure of sitting with Professor Bascom.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yes, the Harlem Renaissance man. Now, Professor Bascom, I want you to tell me about your latest book, where we can find it, and what the theme of the book is.
Okay, the latest book is called Harlem, Crucible of Modern African American Culture. You can purchase it on Amazon or any place that books are sold. And the theme is, the story of the Harlem Renaissance is kind of a skewed story, as I found in my research. What's missing in most histories about the Renaissance are the progressive movements, the many progressive movements, simultaneous progressive movements that grew up in Harlem and then fanned out into the rest of the country. For example, you have The Crisis, the NACP magazine, which was founded by W.E. Du Bois in Harlem. You have The Messenger, which was a newspaper published by William Randolph. And you had all kinds of movements, the Marcus Garvey movement. You had the March on Washington movement, which almost nobody knows about, in Harlem. You had Thurgood Marshall working out of a storefront in Harlem for the NACP, but traveling around the country defending African Americans for all kinds of crimes and plotting, along with professors at Howard, to attack segregated schooling. And this wasn't a happenstance. He didn't just show up in front of the Supreme Court. He plotted and planned and went around the country defending African Americans in different cases in order to build the case that he eventually presented before the Supreme Court. But this was all based in New York. And you had legal scholars from Harvard coming into Harlem to plot this plan, this scheme, if you will, to attack segregated schooling, which resulted in Brown versus Board of Education. This was all plotted in meetings with the NACP in Harlem, with W.E. Du Bois in Harlem. How can we attack this thing? You had doctors had their own clinics who did a famous study, the Black Doll study, which was done in Harlem. And the study showed that if you give black children a black doll and a white doll, they'll choose the white doll because they think that the black doll is inferior. Thurgood Marshall used that study in his argument for the Supreme Court to show that segregation harms black children with this black doll study. But that was done in Harlem as well. So there were all these simultaneous things going on in Harlem, way beyond the music and beyond the literature, beyond the poetry, beyond the artistic side of Harlem. There was a Harlem Renaissance, which everyone wants to talk about, which is fine. That was part of what happened. But you had Dorothy West, my literary grandmother, which I adopted her. Well, the same way Alice Walker adopted Zora, I adopted Dorothy. And I've done one book on Dorothy, and I just adore Dorothy. She was just this sweet old woman, this sweet little teenager who showed up in New York, unafraid, unintimidated, and just worked her magic as a writer. I mean, a really skillful writer. I found her stories at the Library of Congress too. And she's, here's what happened. One of her stories that I found was called My Baby, unpublished, written in 1938. I brought it back to Connecticut. I took it to our literary journal, and I said to them, read this story. They read this story. They said, we have to publish this. We have to publish this. And so for the first time since 1938, one of Dorothy's stories that had not been published was published in the Connecticut Journal, our literary journal. The next year, Dorothy was included in America's Best Short Stories, along with famous people. Now, she had already died, but my research allowed me to take one of these stories from Washington, bring it to Connecticut, and then bring it to Houghton Mifflin, who published it in America's Best Short Stories, I believe in the year 2000. And that was the crowning achievement for me. And everyone wants to give me credit for it. I said, no, I wasn't in America's Best Short Stories. Dorothy West was in America's Best Short Stories.
But you brought the dark into the light, so that's very commendable.
That's what journalism is. That's what good journalism is. And I was more than delighted to see Dorothy's story honored that way, to see her honored that way.
Well, Professor Bascom, I am so honored and privileged to have been sitting next to you here today.
Well, thank you.
And I'm looking forward to your next novel. Please, and maybe we'll catch up to you on your lecture tours and everything else. Thank you for being live at New Hope Baptist Church. Amanda Jane, honestly speaking, celebrating Black History Month with an unsung hero who has just been sung, Professor Bascom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.